Good afternoon, all. I, Dr. Sriram Doshi, Secretary GPA Pune, welcomes you all for today's lecture. It is given by well-known infectious disease specialist Dr. Bharat Purandare. He will talk on fever in GP. Now I hand over charge to GPA President Dr. Rupa Agarwal to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Doshi. Good evening, friends. Fever in general practice. I guess कोणत्याही जीपीची क्लिनिक दिवसाला मिनिमम 10 ते 15 फीवरचे पेशंट बघितल्याशिवाय कंप्लीट होऊच शकत नाही. So such a common topic of fever, and to which if the infection like swine flu some few years back or COVID in current situation has created a havoc all over the earth, not just Pune or India, सगळ्या जगभरामध्ये. तर अशा प्रकारचा हा फीवर आणि त्याला काय काय डिफरन्शियल डायग्नोसिस होऊ शकतात याच्याबद्दलची चर्चा करण्यासाठी we have our well known and very much close to us, one among us, Dr. Bharat Purandare. So without any further delay, I'll request Dr. Doshi sir to introduce Dr. Bharat Purandare. Though sir does not need that introduction, but yes, still we would like to introduce him formally.
Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Bharat Purandare passed his MBBS and MD medicine from BJ Medical College, Pune. He got gold medal in medicine in 2001. MD medicine from BJ Medical College, Pune. Past fellowship in infectious disease from Hinduja Hospital, Mumbai. Working as a consultant in infectious diseases for last 11 years in Pune. Has publications in national journals and presentation done of many national and international conferences. Currently a part of COVID care team at Territory Care Hospital, Pune, and member of Pune COVID Task Force. Now I hand over charge to Dr. Purandare sir.
Question answer.
I request audience to please ask any question answer in the chat box. Put in the chat box. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you for introducing me. I thank GPA Pune for giving me an opportunity to speak in front of 100+ audience, which are all I believe general practitioners, and I thank the GPA, Dr. Agarwal, Dr. Doshi for giving me an opportunity to speak in front of such a knowledgeable audience. And as all of us know, की पुणेकर खूप काय म्हणतात त्याला चिकित्सक असतात, त्यामुळे I know that the audience will be चिकित्सक and I will welcome all sorts of questions at the end. So आजच्या या टॉक मध्ये मला हा टॉपिक दिलेला आहे, फीवर इन जनरल प्रॅक्टिस. आय होप की तुम्हाला सगळ्यांना स्क्रीन इज विजिबल.
Yes sir, it is very much clear.
A large part of a general practitioner's practice is fever. आणि खरं सांगायचं तर एखाद्या फिजिशियन कडे किंवा इन्फेक्शियस डिसीज प्रॅक्टिस करणाऱ्या माणसाकडे येणारे 10% असतील. 100% तर पहिल्यांदा जनरल प्रॅक्टिशनर कडे जातात, तिथून काही गाळून वगैरे दे गो टू द फिजिशियन्स, आणि तिथून सुद्धा काही गाळून वगैरे आमच्याकडे येतात. सो वी आर सीइंग ओनली अ पार्ट ऑफ द इनफॅक्ट, मी म्हणेन टिप ऑफ द आइसबर्ग वी आर सीइंग, बट द होल आइसबर्ग जो ऍक्च्युअल आइसबर्ग आहे दॅट इज बीइंग सीन बाय जनरल प्रॅक्टिशनर्स. सो आय टॉक विथ डॉक्टर अगरवाल अँड डिसाइडेड की हा टॉपिक आपण आता घेऊया. बाकी पण 2-3 टॉपिकचा मी विचार केला होता, but we will take those topics subsequently. पण हा near and dear to everyone's heart disease topic आहे. So let us start. So next 30 minutes or so I will talk about certain common infectious disease conditions in general practice, and I will share certain important, easy to remember clinical pearls of how to diagnose and treat those infectious diseases. Obviously सगळे इन्फेक्शन तर काही 30 मिनिट्स मध्ये घेता येणार नाहीयेत. आय गॉट अप्रॉक्सिमेटली 26 स्लाइड्स, आणि मग त्याच्यानंतरचे उरलेले आपण डिस्कशननी वी विल गो अहेड अँड डिस्कस द रिमेनिंग टॉपिक्स इफ एनी रिमेनिंग. सो व्हॉट अबाउट फीवर? आणि what about its role in physician's practice? सो मला वाटत नाही जगामध्ये असा कोणी एकही माणूस असेल की ज्याला आयुष्यात कधी ताप आलेला नाहीये. नक्कीच सगळ्यांनाच, इव्हन इन्क्लुडिंग अवर सेल्स ऑल्सो, वी हॅव डेव्हलप्ड फीवर सम पॉइंट ऑफ टाइम in our life. So it's a common complaint in day-to-day practice, and I would say 10 to 20% of everyone's practice is a fever. And it's a difficult or perplexing problem because sometimes it may be very simple, but sometimes it may turn out to be a very, very dreadful disease, such as a malignancy or a lymphoma, which first presented as fever. So we really don't know when somebody comes to us with just fever, what is actual cause of his fever sometimes is not immediately apparent. So what is the role of a general practitioner? The role is to identify which are the patients who are dangerous, whose fever may be dangerous, who should be diagnosed early, or better way, who should be referred early. Sometimes try to give a satisfactory treatment for most of the other patients of fever so that they won't have to go to other practitioner or maybe a physician later on for the same complaint. We have to identify which patients may require admission, because at some point of time we get fooled. Even after 5, 10, 20 years of practice also, sometimes we might just get fooled and somebody else tells the patient, so many days you are getting fever, why your practitioner did not tell you admission? And then the patient comes to you and asks you, why didn't you advise me admission? And then suddenly we feel ourselves that we are actually fooled. So we'll have to identify which patients need admission if they are coming with persistent fever. The diagnosis, as I told you, may not be apparent in all patients in the first place. Investigations are often required. So I would say that it's not possible to diagnose fever in today's era without at least basic set of investigations. I would tell you that even if you don't attend the whole lecture, but just take 2 things from today's lecture, it is a success. And those 2 things are, if you have to examine a patient of fever, you'll need time to be given, invested into the patient's examination, because frequently the answer to why this patient is getting fever may lie in the patient's examination or history. And frequently, because of the number of patients that the general practitioner has to handle, sometimes 80, sometimes 100, sometimes 200. I believe that there will be some practitioners who have got 200 OPD every day. So how much time you can give to one single patient? But still you'll have to give time to certain patients. Like for today, for example, in my OPD, I had approximately 27 patients and I had to give 45 minutes time to one patient, and remaining patients I could finish within 5-10 minutes each. So you'll have to identify amongst all the patients, which patient is going to take your more time. So number one thing is invest time into examination and history taking for a fever patient, and do not try to cut corners, or I would say take shortcuts. You expose the patient properly. Frequently what we do in our practices, we just examine, check pulse, and then just put stethoscope in the chest and then say, oh, everything is okay. But we fail to remove patient's shirt, and the cause of the fever may be inside. So I'll tell you one example of this, so that you'll understand that how it is important to expose the patient. So once I had a reference for a patient who had fever, and I went to see the patient in one of the practitioners' hospital. The patient was getting fever, chills. He was totally covered with blanket till the neck, and he was like having shivering. WBC count was 18,000. I examined the patient through the blanket. I did not remove the blanket. That was my mistake. And then later I wrote some investigations. I said, get blood culture done, X-ray chest, 2D echo, USG abdomen, whatnot. And then wrote some 2-3 antibiotics and said, I'll come back later after 2-3 days and we'll find out what is the cause of fever. The very next day, I got a call from the houseman of that hospital that, sir, you saw a patient of cellulitis yesterday. He's now better. I said, what cellulitis? When it was there? So I went back to see the patient. I removed the blanket from the patient's body and I found that his both legs were having cellulitis up to knees. Very red, fiery, and warm feet were there. So it was, diagnosis was just obvious. If I would have uncovered that patient at that point of time, the diagnosis was obvious. And then I started thinking whether I wrote sonography, 2D echo, blood culture, was it all required? Probably it wasn't, because the diagnosis was just below the patient's blanket. Another example of how we miss the diagnosis frequently is that one of the doctor friends came to me and said that I've got fever and myalgia for 2 days and I don't know what it is. Please check me. So I said, okay, I'll check you. The doctor was a female. So I checked that doctor and I said, Ki, it looks like some viral thing. You get a CBC done. There is no cause apparent. And then she just left from my room. And then when she came back suddenly and she said, Ki, why don't you see my sleeve? And then she just put her sleeve up and she showed me a lesion over here on the arm. And it was what? It was chicken pox. It was varicella. So I said the diagnosis is apparent right now on your forearm. So when I called my female assistant and I exposed that doctor, I found that there were numerous lesions of chickenpox on the concealed areas of the body, and nothing was apparent on her face or on her feet or hands. So if I would have exposed her, I would have got diagnosis right there and there only. So before the investigations, the clinical examination cannot be shortcut. It cannot be a shortcut. So sometimes diagnosis may be simple and you just need to invest some time, expose the patient properly, ask some leading questions and get the answer. Many times it happens that patient goes to a general practitioner, the GP 2-3 visits are done, but they don't get the cause of it. It causes a lot of anxiety on the part of the patient also and the general practitioner also. So these are all the problems about patients coming to a general practitioner and not getting diagnosed. So here we are going to try and see that how can we get a diagnosis in 1 or 2 visits without wasting much of the patient's resources and without the need of referral. At the same time, we'll have to identify those patients who need a quick referral, and we don't want to play around with that patient at the level of general practitioner. So even those patients will have to identify. And I believe that most of you are experienced enough to identify such patients. Although I've invested some time and given a slide about what fever patients should generally be referred by general practitioners without wasting much time on them, because they are quite borderline patients. So that I will discuss in few slides. So whenever a patient of fever comes to you on OPD basis, these are the various diagnoses, as you can see on this slide, that you should think of. So if your patient is complaining of a short 7 days or less of fever, and maybe some myalgias and joint pains, some rashes here and there, then think of dengue, think of chikungunya, and think of malaria. And sometimes, you know, patient's residence can give you a clue. So if a patient is coming in from Shirwal or from Satara or from say Tirupati Balaji trip, I would think about malaria, because malaria is quite common in these areas. If somebody comes to me from Vanavadi, I will not definitely think of quickly malaria, because I know that there is no pocket of malaria in Vanavadi. But you'll have to keep your eyes open, keep on watching the news, keep on reading the newspaper, and in some corner of a newspaper, you may find a clue that, okay, in this area of Bibwewadi, there is a pocket of chikungunya, or okay, area of Parvati Darshan, there is a pocket of dengue. So that diagnosis can be helpful, especially when patient comes and tells, I'm from Parvati Darshan. Then you correlate in your mind, okay, I just 2-3 days back, I read in newspaper that there is a pocket of that particular disease in that area. So that the epidemiology from where the patient has come also is very important while making some initial assumption of what a patient has. If patient has got alternate day fever and chills, then I'm going to think about malaria. If patient's fever has already crossed 1 week, then I'm going to think about enteric fever. If patient's fever, myalgia, body aches, neck pain, subconjunctival hemorrhage, icterus is there, I'm going to think about viral hepatitis, leptospirosis. If patient is coming to me with high-grade fever and throat pain, I'm going to think about bacterial pharyngitis, or also called as strep throat, that is streptococcal throat. And in today's times, I'm also going to think about COVID-19 and H1N1 if patient is coming with a short history of fever, dry cough, and sore throat. A common complaint of patients who come to general practitioner is burning urination. So if they come to you with frequency burning urination, then UTI should be thought about. Some patients frequently attend general practitioner's OPD with diarrhea, and then the general commonest prescription which is given to them is ciprofloxacin and tazobactam combination, isn't it? Am I right or wrong? So if you give this kind of prescription, I believe what is the difference between ourselves and a rickshawala? A rickshawala can go and have ciprofloxacin, tazobactam even from chemist. Why are we writing a chemist? Are we a chemist? We are a doctor. So we'll have to find out that, and one has to remember that more than 90% of diarrheas do not require antibiotics. They just need paracetamol and hydration. We quickly jump on to antibiotics. If the last patient you have given ciprofloxacin, tazobactam, the next patient we want to give doxycycline. The next patient we want to give some Bactrim DS or some other antibiotic or some cefixime or some cefixime clavulunate, or if somebody is fond of some other antibiotic such as some carbapenem, then they will end up writing Dioname or Faroname and something. So remember that more than 90% of inflammatory diarrhea does not need antibiotics. They will subside on their own. So if your patient doesn't respond to the antidiarrheal treatment, to the hydration, to the paracetamol in 2 to 3 days, tell him to come back and then prescribe him an antibiotic. And generally, an antibiotic which is prescribed by practitioner should not be ciprofloxacin TZ, because there is a lot of resistance to ciprofloxacin in our community. And tazobactam, or the that drug, that is basically required for amoebic diarrhea. And remember that amoebic diarrhea is more than 10 days. Generally, amoebic diarrhea is chronic. It doesn't come with fever. It takes more than 10 days for the patients to reach a doctor because it is waxing and waning. So unless your patient has more than 10 days of diarrhea, we are not going to give metronidazole. Remember that. Metronidazole may not be the first drug to be given. If patient is having diarrhea of more than 10 days, then obviously metronidazole. And if the diarrhea is secretory or inflammatory, you will need at least a stool routine examination. So before prescribing antibiotics, it may not be a bad idea to tell the patient to bring the stool for examination. And I'll tell you that more than 90% of the patients' diarrhea will stop by the time they try to collect the stool. So just hydration and paracetamol for most of the patients. For those who don't respond in 2 to 3 days, then give antibiotics. And for patients who are having diarrhea more than 10 days, then we are going to give them anti-amoebic treatment in the form of metronidazole or secnidazole or so on. TB and HIV are also common cause of fever who come in outpatient setting, and most of the general practitioners will not find it difficult to diagnose the case of TB or HIV. And sometimes seasonal infections such as mumps or varicella or measles, which generally happen in summer period from say February to August, patients will come to you with these illnesses. So it is relatively easy to diagnose. Somebody who's young got fever and enlarged parotids, it's gonna be mumps. And somebody who's got vesicular lesions all over the body, it's going to be varicella. And similar cases with measles, that they get a measles like rash all over the body. In today's times, we'll have to think about some certain emerging infections when a patient comes to general practitioner. So we'll have to think about rickettsial infections, MRSA, then this severe acute respiratory syndrome virus, which came in 2002. I remember that when I was the resident in Sassoon Hospital in 2002, 2003, there were patients of SARS coming in and they were admitted in. They were actually from Guangdong province of China. There was a travel history and these patients got admitted in one of the isolation wards of Sassoon Hospital. And we used to go to see them with all the cap, mask and a respirator on. We used to look like astronauts at that time. Then this new infection came called as Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus in 2014. So patients who went to Dubai or Saudi Arabia or Bahrain or Abu Dhabi, then they came back with a syndrome which is similar to what we are seeing today in COVID-19. So that infection was rampant in 2014 and we had seen some cases of MERS-CoV at that time. Then in 2014 in Ahmedabad, we got a epidemic of hemorrhagic fever called as Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever or CCHF. Some of you may just remember. And few doctors and nurses also died during that epidemic. So it was a localized disease. Similarly, in 2018, a localized disease called as Nipah virus encephalitis happened in Kerala. And we got more than 900 cases of this disease and few deaths also because of Nipah virus encephalitis. And today, all of us are struggling with COVID-19. All of us know how COVID-19 comes and presents and what is the treatment for it. So all these are emerging infections. And if you see that most of them are viral infections. So I would say the coming season is of viruses. It will be dominated by viruses because we have no good drugs against viruses. For most of the bacteria, we have at least some drugs, but for most of the viruses, we don't have drugs. So the coming era is going to be of viruses. Sorry. So let's discuss this case now. So he was a 44-year-old male, non-diabetic, non-hypertensive, and he was basically a farmer from Paud, which is a village nearby Pune. Most of you may know where is Paud. He came with complaint of fever and chill since 10 days. When I examined the patient, I found that patient is anemic, patient is icteric, and there is a splenomegaly. Patient's hemogram was seen, and it was hemoglobin 9.8, WBC 3,300, and platelet count of 44,000. So what's going to be your diagnosis after seeing all this? I believe that most of the people who are seeing this slide would think about dengue. Some of you will think about malaria. Some of you will think about leptospirosis. So let's examine each of these diagnoses here. So if it is dengue, is it possible that he has got a low hemoglobin of 9.8? Slightly less likely, because dengue comes with hemoconcentration. The hemoglobin rises, and I've seen hemoglobins of 15, 17, and even 20 during the capillary leak phase of dengue. So HB of 9.5 doesn't fit into that. WBC of 3,300 can happen in both dengue as well as malaria and even enteric fever. But in leptospirosis, generally you get leukocytosis. So this WBC doesn't fit well into leptospirosis, although it is not impossible, but I would say that it is slightly less likely. And platelet count of 44,000 can happen in all. Dengue is the most favorite one after hearing this platelet count. But remember that even in malaria, you get low platelet count. Even in lepto, you get low platelet count. Even in enteric fever, you can get low platelet count. Because of the splenomegaly, which happens with these diseases, there is an increased destruction of the platelets and decreased lifespan of the platelets. So considering the rural background and fever with chill since 10 days and an anemia and leukothrombopenia, I would put my first diagnosis here as malaria, and then lepto, and then maybe dengue and maybe enteric. So that's what turned out to be. When we actually sent his peripheral smear, we found that he was Plasmodium vivax positive. So hemogram here has given you a clue of what patient can have. And I would say that if you are working in the most rural settings where people don't have money to do any investigation, and you have been told to do only one investigation for a patient of fever, it should be peripheral smear or hemogram. Hemogram is a very, very useful investigation that can immediately tell you a difference between a viral and bacterial infection. Platelet count low, your differential diagnosis narrows down to malaria, dengue, and so on. Platelet count normal, other diseases. High WBC count, bacterial, low WBC count, you can think about viral infection. So if you are allowed only one investigation, I would say that go for hemogram in any fever patient. At least do a hemogram if the fever has been there for 3 to 5 days. Then a general practitioner frequently also sees some uncommon causes of fever during outpatient setting, such as brucellosis, rickettsiosis, viral infections such as Epstein-Barr virus, cytomegalovirus, herpes simplex virus, and sometimes non-infectious causes such as hematological malignancy like leukemia, lymphoma, drug fever, and certain autoimmune disorders such as SLE or rheumatoid fever or rheumatic fever also can produce a fever and may not be necessarily an infection. So when patients do get admitted, what are the common causes of fever? Sometimes some general practitioners do have a small hospital setup of 5-10 beds, and they admit patients of fever. Think about these diagnoses in those admitted patients. They could have dengue fever, malaria, leptospirosis, enteric fever, TB, HIV. It could be just community acquired pneumonia, or it could be viral pneumonia such as H1N1, COVID-19, or UTI. And sometimes they can get cellulitis, as I told you in one of the cases previously. Sometimes necrotizing fasciitis, which is a very dreadful form of cellulitis, and a diabetic foot. So think about all these infections when a patient is admitted, and we'll have to send tests accordingly. depending upon what the symptoms of the patients are and what is the etiology of that particular symptoms. Now, as a general practitioner, we are not supposed to know very serious names of various different difficult bacteria, but at least you should know this NDM as a general practitioner. So what is NDM? NDM is a New Delhi metabad-lactamase, which is an enzyme which destroys the carbapenems. So this patient is having a gram-negative infection, and that bug, gram-negative bug, is producing this enzyme NDM, and therefore the carbapenems cannot work with this, and we'll have to give them certain higher antibiotics such as fosfomycin or polymyxins. So we should just at least know this term, even though a very detailed meaning of this term may not be known at the GP level. But what is NDM? We should be able to answer. NDM is New Delhi metallo-beta-lactamase, which is gram-negative sepsis caused by these organisms producing this enzyme. Let's take another case. So this was a 23-year-old man. He was a technician in ITI. He came in with fevers of 2 weeks and headaches. He had been treated by other physicians. His Vidal test has been done outside, which was negative. He was on these antibiotics, Augmentin first for 2-3 days. Then there was no fever response. So the practitioner switched over to Cefpod, which was also given for 3 days. There was no response, but still he was getting fever. On examination, there was nothing, just fever. We got a hemogram done and it shows this: hemoglobin of 14, leukocyte count of 2,920 with 0 eosinophil count and a platelet count of 86,000. And additionally, we got a liver enzyme done which only showed an abnormal value of HGPT of 118. Now with this background, what do you think will be the diagnosis? So see here, fever is already crossed 2 weeks. He's a young man, frequently eats outside food, and there is a lot of headache, but there is no meningitis signs at all. And if there was meningitis, the WBC count would not be 2,900. So this patient most likely has enteric fever, because in an enteric fever, you will get leukopenia, thrombocytopenia, and practically zero eosinophil count. So you have to check your patient's hemogram very carefully. So not only WBC and platelets are important, the differential diagnosis is also important. So see what is the polymorphonuclear count, what is the lymphocyte count, what they have mentioned about eosinophil count. And frequently you will find that multiple hemograms of patients with enteric fever will show that eosinophil count is 0. So now some of the labs may not have courage to report a 0 eosinophil count, and they frequently correct and give 1 or 2 eosinophils. But most of the labs who are automated will give a frankly 0 eosinophil count. So when you feel that the patient's hemogram is showing this pattern, think about enteric fever. Most of them do have some amount of transaminitis, and therefore that high HGPT also fits into it. So I would say that this could be enteric fever in spite of a negative Vidal. Remember that Vidal may not be positive in all patients with enteric fever. Similarly, all patients who have got a positive Vidal may not have enteric fever. They may have some different diagnosis, but because of the previous memory of the previous enteric fever, they may have just a false positive Vidal, which is called as anamnestic reaction. So suppose somebody gets typhoid fever now, and after 6 months he gets dengue, and you do Vidal, it might still come positive. So another infection also rises tighter the previously obtained Vidal. So that is called as anamnestic reaction. So don't sign off by saying that all patients who have got positive Vidal always have typhoid. They may have a different diagnosis, and Vidal titer may be positive because of memory of the previous infection. Similarly, all patients who have got typhoid may not show a positive Vidal. And at general practitioner level, we are worried to do blood culture, but we are very, very happy to do Vidal. Nowadays, remember, the patients do afford blood culture, which costs 800 rupees, and it gives you a gold standard diagnosis of typhoid fever. So why not send a blood culture rather than Vidal? In my last 10 years of infectious practice, I have not done a single Vidal test. I have always diagnosed most of my patients of enteric fever based upon blood culture. So, but see, this patient has received Augmentin and Cefpod. So the blood culture may not come positive because of antibiotic receipt. So here, if you give ceftriaxone in typhoid dose, which is 2 grams twice daily, 4 grams per day, the patient responds to it. It can act as a therapeutic trial and also still retrospectively prove diagnosis of typhoid fever in a patient who has got a negative blood culture. Another case, 55-year-old male diabetic. He came in from Shirwal and he got wet in the rains. There was a high-grade fever, conjunctival hemorrhage, neck pains, body aches, and icterus. And we found that his hemoglobin was 12, TLC count of 13,400, platelet count of 26,000, a direct bilirubin of 12, a complete bilirubin of 12, direct of 8, creat of 4.3, and a low albumin of 1.2. What do you think will be the diagnosis? So most of you must have thought that diagnosis may be leptospirosis, and you are correct because he's coming in from a rural area. There is a epidemiologic history that the patient has got wet in the rains. He came through a puddle of the pooled water, and this icterus, conjunctival hemorrhage, leukocytosis, and thrombocytopenia, and rise in bilirubin and creatinine will definitely favor leptospirosis as a diagnosis. At the same time, low albumin also favors leptospirosis as a diagnosis. So see, we are not here doing lepto-IgM. It is just based upon hemogram and symptomatology and from where patient has come. We are trying to get some diagnosis. You may not be always correct, but at least we start thinking in that direction. Sometimes for an admitted patient, you will be surprised that the patients may turn out to have pyogenic meningitis, liver abscess, infective endocarditis, osteomyelitis, certain nosocomial infections such as pneumonia or a UTI, autoimmune disorders, and drug fever. So remember that a patient who has got abnormal LFTs and WBC count high, think of liver abscess. Think of liver abscess. The patient has got a triad of fever, headache, and vomiting. Think of pyogenic meningitis. A patient who has got fever for 1 month, weight loss, absence of peripheral pulses, and a cardiac murmur on auscultation, think of infective endocarditis. So that symptom complex itself is going to tell you that, oh, possibly this may be the diagnosis. So how a general practitioner should approach to a patient of fever? So first of all, when a patient comes and tells you I've got fever, you'll have to ask him how many days you have got fever, what is the grade of fever? Is it low grade or is it very, very high grade? So for most people who have done COVID practice, they would understand that COVID fever is not very high. So getting a fever of 106 and 107 doesn't happen in COVID. They'll get fever of now 100, 101. But malaria patient with dengue can have fevers of 106 and 107. And I myself have seen a patient with fever of 108 and diagnosis turned out to be dengue. So very high grade fever is not common in COVID, but very, very high grade fevers are common in viral disorders such as COVID-19, H1N1, malaria, and so on. An alternate day fever will point a diagnosis towards malaria, but may not be always the case. Similarly, patients who got evening rise fever can have coughs as a favorite diagnosis, but sometimes it can also happen in brucellosis. But noting the periodicity is important. A patient who has got fever of less than 1 week, generally think about viral causes. Patient of viral fever is unlikely to have fever for more than 1 week. So when fever crosses 1 week, the diagnosis will change from viral fever to either enteric fever or leptospirosis or liver abscess or infective endocarditis or some alternative cause. But generally viral fevers lasting for more than 7-8 days is unusual. Other symptoms you have to look into the, as I told you, rash. So for noting the rash of the patient, you have to ask patient, do you have rash anywhere on your body? Uncover the patient, remove the patient's shirt, remove the patient's pant, keep the patient on underwears and examine the patient properly. In Sassoon Hospital, when I was doing residency, my seniors used to say that you'll have to strip the patient to get a diagnosis. So whenever, if you have gone in Sassoon wards anytime, you'll understand that there are rows of patients on both sides. The first bed is the examination bed. So here we used to call the patient, strip it to the underwear, check the patient, let him cover himself with clothes and then let go. And we have diagnosed many things that other people had not diagnosed, such as I told you the example of cellulitis during my previous minutes talk. And then also, as I told you, some rashes of varicella in concealed areas of body, some axillary lymphadenopathy, some area of tick bite, which produces an eschar, a rickettsial fever. Also, we have diagnosed after stripping the patient. So stripping the patient is important. Take the patient's consent, strip it. If the patient is female, please keep a female attendant with you. Ask the patient specifically about upper respiratory symptoms, especially in COVID times, and also TB symptoms. So what are the 4 cardinal TB symptoms? evening rise fever, weight loss and appetite loss, night sweats, and cough for more than 2 weeks. So if those 4 cardinal symptoms are there, think about TB. And there could be some examination clues, such as a heart rate. So patient is giving high grade fever, but having bradycardia. That happens in dengue, that happens in leptospira, that happens in brucella, that also happens in COVID. In many COVID patients admitted, we have found a heart rate of 45, 38 or something also. Splenomegaly. When patients of fever have splenomegaly, your differential diagnosis narrows down to malaria, brucellosis, or viral hepatitis, or sometimes leptospirosis, or a splenic abscess, something like that, enteric fever. If patient has icterus and fever, think about viral hepatitis, liver abscess, or even leptospirosis. If patients do have lymph nodes in the neck or in the axilla, think about lymphoma, think about TB, think about HIV. If patient has joint swellings, like say ankle, knees, a tender inflamed joint, think about septic arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, and so on. As I told you, hemogram is one single most important investigation in any patient of fever. And you'll have to look at all components of hemogram closely. What is patient's hemoglobin? If it is low, malaria. If it is high, it could be dengue. WBC low, viral. WBC high, it could be bacterial. DLC, if you've got a low eosinophil count, think about enteric fever. If you've got a low lymphocyte count, that's not a good sign, especially when it comes to COVID. Low platelet count, again your differential diagnosis narrows down to dengue or malaria or leptospirosis or enteric fever. Repeated sampling sometimes from reliable lab is essential. So infrequently we have found that many labs are not doing proper hemograms, are not reporting them properly. So for a patient of fever, you'll have to need a good lab. So a reliable lab, and sometimes in many patients of dengue, we have found that the first hemogram is normal, second hemogram, there is a sudden drop in platelets and WBC. So first hemogram did not pick up the cytopenias, the next one picked up. So 2-3 times first week we have done, and it may be required. Similarly, malarial parasite, just one single report of negative cannot rule out malaria. But if you have got 3-4 reports of negative malarial parasite, then the diagnosis of malaria becomes unlikely. So repeated smears for patients with malarial parasite should be done. Then there are other tests which a GP can obtain when a patient of fever. Urine analysis. All patients, we should not do urine analysis. If patients have got diabetes or patients who have got UTI symptoms, then urine analysis may be useful. Otherwise, just a patient of plain fever, the urine analysis may not be useful. As I told you, Vidal has a limited value in diagnosis of enteric fever. But more important in the second week, so patient crosses 1 week of fever and then you obtain a Vidal, it is much more important. In first week, Vidal may be negative in a frank enteric fever case. Rapid malaria and PS4MP, both of them are similar tests. And some physicians ask me whether we should get a PS4MP or whether we should get rapid malaria for example. Malaria, they are similar. There is no difference in diagnostic yield. Blood culture is very important, at least to be given before antibiotics. I would not say that you obtain blood culture for all fever patients coming to you, but those who have got 5-7 days of fever, one OPD visit already done, they have gone to one GP before and now come to you, 5-7 days, no fever response. Please think about blood culture in those patients, not at the first visit, but at least at the second visit, think about it. If there is fever continuously for 5-7 days and patient is not responding. For many patients who have got pneumonia, X-ray will give you a frank diagnosis. So just put on the X-ray and you will get a diagnosis. USG abdomen can give rise to a clue of dengue, such as bilateral pleural effusions, gallbladder wall edema, some amount of ascites. If that kind of report comes, think about dengue. Liver abscess, wonderfully diagnosed on USG abdomen. For patients in whom you are suspecting COX, a tuberculin test and ESR also may be useful tests. Now see this another case. A 15-year-old female with high-grade fever of 4 days. She had headaches and body aches and neck pains and eye pains, and there was a reddish rash on the trunk and near the ankles. Day 1 hemogram HB was 13.4. On day 2 it became 14.3. WBC count fell from 6,000 to 3,100 and platelet count fell from 2.20 to 70. PSMP has been done on 3 occasions, is negative. So what is your diagnosis? It can't be malaria, isn't it? Because 3 times it has been done, negate, and hemo concentration is happening, HB is rising, WBC is falling, platelet is falling. So I think here we are dealing with dengue, and that turned out to be the case in this particular case. So a good history, a good clinical examination, a judicious use of tests from reliable labs, repeating some tests as required, and if at all you find it slightly difficult, you can take help of your colleague that this patient of fever I'm not able to diagnose. Do you have any clue? Or referral of this patient to either a physician or an infectious disease also can be thought of if patient fever is not responding. Now in next coming few slides in 5 minutes, we are going to discuss some important points about each of these diseases, specific diseases. Like dengue fever, you all know that patients do come in with fever and body aches and backaches. They get altered sleep pattern, and generally most of them get a macular rash or petechial rash on the ankles especially. USG of abdomen shows typical changes as told you before, bilateral pleural effusions, GB wall edema, and some amount of ascites. Successive hemograms keep on showing you a hemoconcentration happening, leukopenia happening, thrombocytopenia happening, and LFTs are frequently altered. About dengue, NS1 test is positive in most of the patients in first 3 days. After 3 to 5 days of fever, there is no test which is positive. And after 5 to 6 days of onset of fever, the IgM starts coming positive. So frequently GP sends all these 3 tests together. Like a net, a board net, kuch to bhi milega usme. It's not the case. You'll have to know what is the day on which I'm advising the test. So if patient's fever is 6 days of duration, I'm going to advise not NS1, but IgM. Because IgM will start coming positive after 5 to 7 days. NS1 is positive for first 3 days. Most of the dengue fever is managed by IV fluids, oral fluids, and multivitamins. Very, very rarely we end up giving them platelet transfusion. Here in Dinath Mangeshkar, we generally transfuse if the platelet count starts falling below 10,000 or if they start bleeding. So this is a typical rash of dengue, a very confluent petechial rash which is on the extremities. Most of you must have seen this rash in many of your patients. About chikungunya, currently there is a pocket of chikungunya in Varze, Malwadi and in Kondve, Dhaude area. So patients come in from that area with symptoms such as high-grade fever, sometimes rashes which are measles-like, and joint swellings, and especially small joints of hand. They are very, very painful, and patients frequently feel that closing the fist or opening the fist becomes difficult for them, and their WBC count is frequently normal. Very, very rarely they will develop a thrombopenia. Dengue serology is negative, and chikungunya IgM starts becoming positive after 5 to 7 days of illness. That is during the second week of illness. Most of them are treated supportively with paracetamol, NSAIDs, and sometimes hydroxychloroquine. Patients of malaria, they will come with fevers of alternate day, chills, sometimes paroxysmal fevers, and very, very bad sweating episodes. They frequently have anemia, splenomegaly, and mild icterus. You will find that there is leukopenia, thrombocytopenia on hemogram with abnormal LFTs in most patients, and PS or rapid MP is positive. If not during first, but second or third testing, it will come out to be positive. So repeated testing should be done for patients who have a suspicion of malaria. Treatment of Vivax and falciparum is entirely different. Vivax is definitely treated with chloroquine, with primaquine later on, and falciparum is treated with artesunate, sometimes with sulfadazine and pyrimethamine, or sometimes even with doxycycline or quinine. About H1N1 as well as COVID-19 infection, this is the current epidemic going on. You all know what are the symptoms of this infection, so I'm not going to details of that. But remember that patients may tell you that I've got a lot of throat pain, but if you examine the throat, you don't find anything abnormal in the throat. So fever is disproportionate and throat is really normal. One of the family members also may be affected. WBC count is either normal or low, but reduced lymphocyte count is a poor prognosis. Increased monocytes, normal to low platelet count. And here you get an esophageal and oropharyngeal swab for diagnosis. And all of you know what is the diagnosis treatment of this disease. Now people have tried antibiotics, azithromycin, Tamiflu in all of them, except for H1N1, Tamiflu doesn't work anywhere else. So I would advise you that do not use Tamiflu in COVID-19. For most of the COVID-19 patient, treatment is symptomatic. For a few of them, drugs such as Favipiravir, Remdesivir can be indicated, but it's a different topic altogether. Typhoid fever is a very, very common fever which presents to a general practitioner. So you have to know the symptoms of ventral fever. So frequently this patient is a young patient, young male or young female in 20s or 30s, hostel residents or staying outside food intake, abdominal pain and loose motions for some time, followed by fever, which is just not going for 2 to 3 weeks. Frequently fever has crossed 1 week when they come to you. Sometimes it responds to antibiotic course and then again it comes back after 4 or 5 days. If you do a hemogram, you will find that there is leukopenia, thrombopenia, low platelets, and eosinophil count frequently is either low or zero. LFTs are altered. Gold standard is blood culture. Treatment is with high dose of ceftriaxone, which is 4 grams per day of ceftriaxone. Sometimes we do tend to treat them with azithromycin and levofloxacin in some patients. When a general practitioner should refer a patient of fever, this is one of the most important questions of today's talk. So any patient who is coming to GP or his hospital is admitted there and gets hemodynamic instability, please refer. Do not keep with you unless you have got ICU facility. A patient whose subsequent X-rays show on worsening, first X-ray small pneumonia, next X-ray both sides pneumonia, third X-ray very bad X-ray, please shift the patient. Patient might need ventilation. So worsening X-ray or a patient who have got functions of organ function damage, such as the very high bilirubin, high creatinine, breathlessness is there, acidosis is there, dialysis may be required. Organ failure, if the patient has symptoms of organ failure along with fever, please refer unless you have got ICU facility. Patients who have altered sensorium and seizures, they are difficult to manage in a small setup of a general practitioner. They might need CNS imaging, they might need CSF, they might need intubation. They can throw up seizures which are difficult to control. So please refer these patients to higher center. And for 2 to 3 OPD visits or for 2 to 3 IPD days of admission, if patient's fever is not responding, think about taking another opinion or referring of these patients, because these patients will turn out to have some difficult cause which may not be able to manage at the level of general practitioners. So when these 4 or 5 things are there, think about reference. And then it all depends upon your own gut feeling. You all know that which patients for various other reasons, social reasons also, sometimes you might to refer the patient. That I have not mentioned over here, but these are the medical reasons when to refer the patient. So with this slide, I have finished my today's talk. And if there are any questions from any of the members of the GPA, I will be happy to answer.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Bharat, sir. It has been really a wonderful presentation, actually.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Sir, एक question आहे question box मध्ये. Leukocytosis, neutrophilia, and lymphopenia can be found in day 3 in COVID. Is it possible?
I'm not able to see that.
It's questions मध्ये आहेत, sir. Leukocytosis, neutrophilia, and lymphopenia. Day 3 la
neutrophilia, lymphopenia can be found in day. See, generally leukocytosis is not going to be found in COVID-19 unless they get a secondary bacterial infection. So if you get a secondary bacterial infection, that frequently happens in second week of illness of COVID-19, second week of admission, I would say, for COVID-19, you get leukocytosis. And as I told you, lymphopenia is a poor prognostic marker. So if a patient who has got a low relative lymphocyte count, these patients are likely to worsen or go on to ventilators. So we'll have to watch those patients quite closely. Next question is, what is the role of steroids in fever, especially steroids, especially in dengue? Answer is they are indicated or they are detrimental, and generally steroids are not indicated for 2 reasons. Number 1, they will increase the risk of getting secondary infection. Number 2, they will also increase the risk of rebound thrombocytopenia. When you stop, suddenly the platelets will drop. So I have used steroids in dengue, especially in patients to avoid transfusions. Like for example, patient's platelet count was rapidly dropping, 1.5 lakhs, and it became 1 lakh and became 20,000. And I was certain that unless I give him something, he's going to need platelet transfusion. And for some religious reason, this patient did not want platelet transfusion. So at 20,000 of platelet count, if I'm not going to give platelet transfusion, what else I have got? So I had to give that patient. So steroids I have occasionally used in young patients who are on the verge of requiring a platelet transfusion. Otherwise, I have not used steroids in dengue. And WHO handbook on management of dengue clearly mentions that steroids are contraindicated in dengue. Next question is, can typhoid vaccination affect Vidal test? Answer is, I don't know because typhoid vaccination generally previously we used to get this TAV vaccine, but now we get only one vaccine of typhoid in the market, which is an inactivated vaccine. And I generally don't know why it should affect the Vidal test, because vaccine is different and Vidal test is different. So it generally should not affect, but I don't know exactly the answer to this question. Can it affect Vidal test? Because practically for last 10 years, I have not done a Vidal test in any patient, whether vaccinated or not vaccinated. So I don't have answer to this, but definitely I'll try to find whether it can actually affect the Vidal test. But I believe that at least biologically, it's not possible that it should affect the Vidal titers. What is the opinion about COVID vaccine? So this was, I had discussed it with Dr. Agarwal that we should discuss these topics maybe next week or maybe next week. But just in a nutshell, there are two COVID vaccines. Both are equally efficacious and both have got excellent safety profile and almost 8 months of good antibody response comes after taking 2 doses, and it can go up to 1 year, we believe. So without keeping any hesitation in your mind about the efficacy or the safety of the vaccine, please take COVID vaccine. I've read the most recent data in Lancet as well as NEJM, these two journals about vaccine, and I really see no reason why we should reject the vaccine. They are two Indian vaccines which are almost as excellent as what Pfizer or what Moderna company has developed there with millions of dollars of their research. We have got equivalent vaccines, and please do take those vaccines. Excellent safety and excellent efficacy profile. Next question is sent in chat box. Okay, then it would be like, please tell about chikungunya treatment. So I told somebody that just before the way that treatment of chikungunya is symptomatic either with paracetamol or with NSAIDs. So you can use good NSAIDs such as a combination of tramadol and diclofenac, or you can use naproxen for initial getting response, and then you can use a low grade anti-inflammatory drug such as hydroxychloroquine to control chikungunya. If there is a very quick exacerbation, you can use a very short course of steroids. So treatment is mainly symptomatic, then with NSAIDs and then with steroids. What is the role of NSAID? I think it's possibly referring again to chikungunya, and I already told you that NSAIDs are the front line management for chikungunya. CRP as a prognostic marker for viral fever like dengue. So there are no studies which say that CRP can be prognostic marker. At least I'm not aware of any study, especially in dengue. But yes, CRP is a prognostic marker in COVID-19, and people on admission with COVID-19 who have got CRP more than 100, they are the ones who are likely to progress. But I don't know whether dengue can be monitored with frequent testing with CRP. Tramadol and high dose paracetamol when in chikungunya, I believe this is what Dr. Subhash wants to ask. Answer is tramadol and high dose paracetamol in patients who have got very bad pains in chikungunya. Whenever symptoms demand, give them. When symptoms are not there, do not give them. Now, fever due to allergen, how it is differentiated. So generally allergic reactions do not produce fever. Only patients who have acute urticaria, which are the skin rashes, ज्याला आपण गांधी म्हणतो, गांधी आला त्याच्या अंगावरती किंवा पित्त उठलं आपण म्हणतो, आणि असे खूप अचानक उठलं पित्त, then you can get fever. But generally people with allergy will just manifest as sneezing, eosinophilia or itching, and generally don't manifest as fever. So it is very difficult to say that fever can be because of allergies, but yes, anaphylactic reaction and severe urticaria can cause fever on occasions, and the treatment is going to be with either antihistamines or with steroids. Any role of steroids in chikungunya? I told it in the last question. In an acute exacerbation in a patient who's already on NSAIDs or hydroxychloroquine, on top of that, if an exacerbation in symptoms develops of chikungunya, then you can give a short course of steroid of 5 to 7 days. When antibiotics are not used, very, very simple answer. When they are not indicated, they should not be used. But we struggle to find when not to use them. But there are certain people in which you can safely not give antibiotics. For example, first week of COVID, do not give antibiotics. H1N1, do not give antibiotics. Malaria, no need of antibiotics. Chikungunya, no need of antibiotics. See, I have seen that people have diagnosed dengue. Patient is admitted, NS1 or IgM is positive, but monoceph is going on. Why? Then why was the test sent to diagnose? So if we are sending a test and if we are clinching a diagnosis, we should stop monoceph. That comes as a corollary. Similarly, many patients do have some RT or some line or some police. They don't need antibiotic just because the line is there inside their body. Patient of stroke or paralysis, patient of AMI, do they need antibiotics? No, they do not need antibiotics. You have to just treat the stroke or you have to just treat the AMI, but there is no need of antibiotics. So these are some no areas of antibiotics. Yeah, at this point of time, no antibiotics. But when in doubt, you cannot rule out sepsis for sure, then you can give antibiotics. But when you have clinched the diagnosis of malaria and or dengue, you initially started some antibiotic because you did not know what it was, but now you have diagnosed, so please stop it. Injection Prevnar can be given to COVID patient when useful. Prevnar is pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. There are very, very specific indications for giving Prevnar for all patients who are aged more than 50 years or older, patients who have got a chronic pulmonary disease or chronic kidney disease. This vaccine is indicated. Diabetic patient, this is indicated. COVID is not necessarily an indication of giving Prevnar. And in any case, a patient from COVID, let him recover, get discharged, 1.5 months you wait, and then you give them any vaccine. So it may be pneumococcal vaccine, it may be influenza, or it may be any other vaccine. Even for COVID vaccine, they are saying that somebody who just recovered from COVID, you wait for 4 to 6 weeks, and then you give the vaccine. Does COVID positive case takes post-COVID infection COVID vaccine? So I just answered this. Yes, you can take vaccine after 4 to 6 weeks of recovering from COVID, because naturally occurring antibodies after natural COVID infection, they decay fast. Within 3 to 4 months, their antibodies will become negative for many patients. But a vaccine immunity lasts for 1 year. And that's why you have to take COVID vaccine, even if COVID was diagnosed in you and you have now waited for 4 to 6 weeks, you can go ahead with the COVID vaccine because that will give you a long lasting antibody response. Last year, the number of dengue patients were low. Any reason? Answer is dengue is an urban disease. Most of the people who got in the lockdown, they went to their hometowns. Hometowns means rural areas they give. अब पुण्यामध्ये राहणारे 80% लोक तर बाहेरचेच आहेत, 20% फक्त पुणेकर आहेत, सदाशिव पेठवाले. काय बरोबर की नाही? 80% लोक बाहेरनं आलेले आहेत. ते गेले त्यांच्या गावाला परत. लातूरचा माणूस लातूरला गेला, परभणीचा माणूस परभणीला गेला. तिथे त्यांच्याकडे काही डेंग्यू नाहीये, त्यामुळे डेंग्यू पेशंट्स कमी झाले. आय बिलीव्ह दिस मे बी द आन्सर, बट आय म्हणजे टू ऑन अ सिरियस नोट, आय रिअली डोंट नो वाय द पेशंट्स वेर लो. Possibly because of less crowding, less travel here and there. Patients were most of the times in the house. That's why possibly the numbers were low. But don't worry, they are going to rise this year. So आता काही काळजी करू नका, परत आपले डेंग्यू पेशंट नेहमीप्रमाणे आपल्याला मिळतील. Which fever does not respond to paracetamol? Answer is drug-induced fever. So if patient is on certain drugs such as say anticonvulsants, some antibiotics, then they will not respond to paracetamol. Okay. Sometimes patients with COVID also don't respond to paracetamol, and you'll have to give them one NSAID, one shot of NSAID, and then the next fever will respond to paracetamol. So that can happen. So drug fever is known with most of the drugs, but commonly it comes with chemotherapeutic agents, it comes with antibiotics, and almost all antibiotics can cause drug fever. Then anticonvulsants, especially phenytoin, then sulfa drugs, then even quinolones, they can cause fever. Next question. Recently I had a patient with a high grade fever for 2 days. CRP was 65, RT-PCR negative, detected influenza A. So basically he is nothing like a is almost like a influenza patient or a H1N1 patient. So the first further course should be giving him Tamiflu. Then somebody just saying thank you. Okay, thank you for saying thank you. So have we finished all? Yeah, one last question, I believe. Some one or two last questions. Yeah, about CRP. Remember that CRP is an important test for most of the viral infections as well as bacterial infections. Some people have misconception that only bacterial infections will have high CRP and viral will not. It has been proven false now, because in COVID you get very high CRP. So any patient, even with a viral infection such as COVID, can have high CRP. If your CRP is coming down, probably the infection is coming under control. That's what you can say. And if a high CRP is there in COVID-19, especially more than 100, watch this patient closely. He can go on to ventilator. Dr. Shah is asking, what is the dose of Primaquine in falciparum? The standard dose of Primaquine is 7.5 milligrams twice daily for 14 days. What is the rate of resistance of chloroquine in falciparum? So almost all falciparum is resistant to chloroquine in India. So if falciparum malaria is diagnosed, should not use chloroquine. We should use either artesunate or quinine. What is the rickettsia diagnosis and treatment? So for rickettsia, patient has history that he had gone to a rickettsial endemic area. So which are the rickettsial endemic areas around Pune? One is Bhor, Bella, Shirwal, all parts of Marathwada, most parts of Vidarbha, and most of the parts of South India. So they are endemic for rickettsia. So if a patient goes into those areas, comes back to us with fever, and there is a rash on his body, which is also involving patient's palms and soles, and if you find a scar mark there that might has bitten the patient, you get a cigarette burn like mark over there. So if you have got that mark, think about rickettsia. Diagnosis is either clinical or by response to doxycycline within 48 hours. So if you give them doxycycline, they respond in 48 hours. They become all right in 48 hours. So this is what we frequently use. In some patients, we do send rickettsial PCR, especially within first week. And in other patients who have crossed 1 week of illness, we send Bell-Felix test and diagnose rickettsial illness. I think most of the questions are finished. Any other questions are there, Dr. Agarwal?
Sir, one more question is there.
No.
Sir, what is the role of urine culture in recurrent fever? What is your opinion?
Any patient with fever, unless the patient has urinary symptoms, no point in sending a urine culture. Okay. Because I get fever patients all the time. They are referred to me for last 10 years. And I have ended up doing urine cultures for many patients and I have found no answer. So unless the patient says that I have got burning urination, I have got recurrence of urination, I have got frequency, I have got urgency, or pyuria is there on urine routine, or ultrasonography shows some cystitis or some prostate infection, I'm not going to do urine culture. Just because a patient has fever, I'm not going to go behind urine because it will hardly help. Because most of the infections will respond to commonly given antibiotics. When patients come to me, already they have received common antibiotics. So it becomes easy for me to say that this is not UTI.
Thank you, sir. I think all questions are over. Yes, sir?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I, Dr. Sriyam Doshi, Secretary GPA Pune. Thanks, sir. Thanks, Dr. Bharat Purandare, for giving us such an informative and informative lecture. I thanks to White Coat for this, giving us a technical support. I thanks all delegates who attend this lecture. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks all. Okay, sir.
Yeah.